Welcome to the Fearless Project podcast. I'm your host, Dominique Hoffman. And in today's episode, as we anticipate the year anniversary of October 7, we're going to discuss the revolutionary radicalism in the American university system and the generation of social justice activists that system and that institution has produced. We've done past episodes on the neo-Marxist and the anti-Semitic underpinnings or ideological roots of college anti-Semitism. But in today's episode, my guest, Hussein Mansour, is going to be precise in explaining what makes the university system here in America and the social justice movement distinct from classical Marxism. When discussing the ideological left and the American university system, you'll often hear terms such as critical theory, intersectionality, postmodernism, and nihilism used to describe the ideological underpinnings of both left academia and the social justice movement it has produced. Hussein's going to guide the listener through the history of Marxism and Western Marxism in particular, to help us better understand what critical theory in America is and how it's distinctly different from other European traditions. I'm going to read Hussein's bio because I think his expertise in this subject is noteworthy. Hussein Mansour is an Egyptian-American intellectual and a fellow at the Jerusalem Center for Security and Foreign Affairs. He is an author with a career focused on Arab political thought, Arab intellectual history, and the globalization of revolutionary radicalism, which is what we're going to specifically talk about in today's episode. He has made important contributions to understanding the intellectual and political dynamics within the Arab world and their intersections with global issues and the Western left, which will also come into play in today's episode. Previously, he served as an assistant professor of Hebrew language and culture at the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California, and his writings have appeared in Commentary, Tablet, Mosaic, and other publications. I also want to point our audience to his Substack, the Abrahamic Critique and Digest. There's a wealth of knowledge over there, and I myself subscribe and encourage our audience to support Hussein and his work. I hope you enjoy the episode. Hussein Mansour, welcome back to the Fearless Project podcast. I'm so happy to have you back.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
I'm super excited. Your recent lecture for the Pathfinder retreat in Washington, D.C. this summer did very well. I just want to point our audience to that at the top of the episode. So the lecture is entitled Marxism, Anti-Semitism, and the Modern Arab Political World and Thought. So I just encourage the audience to go take a listen and look at that because it'll give some context also to what we talk about here today. But specifically today, with school starting back up and college campuses reconvening classes after the tension that existed on college campuses with the anti-Israel protest last spring semester, I want to contextualize what we'll probably be seeing, especially in the lead up to October 7 and the anniversary of the October 7 massacre, and where a lot of these schools of thoughts come from. So a lot of terms we'll use today just for the audience will be critical theory. When I talk about critical theory, and you can correct kind of my knowledge as well, Hussein, but when I think of critical theory, I think of academic theory taught in American universities, feminist theory, race theory, climate justice. I think of academics such as Judith Butler, who's a famous feminist academic. I think of intersectionality. So the idea that, race, gender, if you have disabilities, your social, economic standing in society somehow describes your position within the hierarchy of the white male patriarchy. So I think of words such as white fragility, white privilege, and then all of that kind of culminates in social justice. So you have like the activism arm of this maybe academic left-leaning ideology on college campuses. And I kind of think of larger concepts such as postmodernism. So this idea that we have to reject, traditional society, traditional marriage, traditional families. And then I think of larger umbrella terms such as, neo-Marxism, which is a term I've used to characterize what we've seen on college campuses. And it's probably for lack of a better or maybe more precise or an articulate word, because I know that neo-Marxism is not monolithic and there's kind of disagreements within the neo-Marxist ideology of what actually constitutes neo-Marxism. And then we just have terms like the American left. So we think of just politically a little bit more self-explanatory than maybe some of the other words. But all of those terms, I think, kind of float together when we characterize what's happening on college campuses, and just even within maybe the Democratic Party when we think of the lead up to the election as well, and how that's shaping policy discussions. So those are kind of some of the big terms. Maybe we could start off with what neo-Marxism is and what it isn't, and why maybe it's a hard term to define. Would that be a good place to start, Hussein?
Yeah, we can start with that. It's a good place. Doesn't mean it's an easy one.
Okay.
Um, so neo-Marxism is a term, just like the term Islamism, that is used to kind of catch a wide net, to try to capture a vast, really, space of intellectual tendencies that have developed primarily since World War One, and gained prominence in the English-speaking world with the rise of the New Left in the 1960s, and also kept developing. That includes tendencies such as critical theory is most famous today, post-structuralism, or what's commonly known as postmodernism, and various kind of a hybrid movements between liberal and Marxist, so the liberal left, so to speak, along with a lot of things that you talked about. So gender theory, people post-colonial theory, Edward Said, Orientalism, these kind of disciplines. One of the ways that you can look at this, I mean, I think we had a podcast episode before, and I explained, I talked about Marxism and the totality of Marxism. That Marxism is really completely an all-inclusive, all-exhaustive, understands itself as a total system, a theoretical system that both understands reality and shapes and desires to shape reality. But this description actually applies only to classical Marxism, let's call it. Or orthodox Marxism, the Marxism that basically became political reality in the Soviet Union, at the hands of Lenin and the Bolshevists. After that, what we can say that happened is the world historic process of the decomposition of Marxism. That is, that very total system really decomposed into various elements that went ahead and merged in a lot of human disciplines. It merged with linguistics, with literary criticism, for instance, which also took off, especially from the UK, and came to the United States later. Psychoanalysis. So you had also this Freudian Marxist mixture, the mixture of with Islam, or with native Middle Eastern and Muslim cultures that generated various forms of revolutionary Islamism, can be seen as part of that global decomposition of Marxism, and so on and so forth. So this decomposition generated, and decomposition, which is this organic analogy, means things disintegrating into various elements that are no longer tied by any cohesive network. And that's actually what these things that we throw under neo-Marxism are. And that's what makes it very difficult to talk about these things. Often we lack the lacking of a clarity. Definition is in large due to the fact that these movements also lack clarity and definition, or tendencies or agitation. Some of them are purely theoretical and they purely reside in the in an academy. Some of them made it out to the street and they became activists. Some of them became institutionalized in things like the DEI, bureaucratic regime, and so on and so forth. Many of them are actually antagonistic to one another. That is, that they don't necessarily talk to each other. So unlike classical or orthodox Marxist theory, that was this total system, it was really a cohesive. It saw itself as something that's all-inclusive, exhaustive, and totally cohesive. So it was a tradition. That is, it was intellectuals talking to each other. kind of like almost an atheistic version of Catholicism. So let's say when you had the Soviet Union, you had the Pope and you had the party, and you had rituals of excommunication, you had apologetics, you had a whole kind of this almost religious structure to it. With the disintegration or decomposition that happened in neo-Marxism, you don't have that. So you don't have people actually talking to each other. You have these developments that many times grow independently. They don't necessarily address each other in any way. Sometimes they even create opposing terminologies. Many times they are actually antagonistic to each other. For example, postmodernism also is antagonistic to critical theory. I mean, I think in a lot of people who don't quite understand these issues, they see critical theory and postmodernism as almost the same thing. But that's basically not true. There are even multiple critical theories, and a lot of them are actually antagonistic to each other. They all share some tendencies, which is a commitment, primarily a radical commitment to really Marxian politics of a total emancipation of humanity. Whether you understand that as individual or collective, that's a whole different issue. But basically, it's that commitment to emancipatory radicalism that ultimately they share with each other and makes them look for others as a unified thing. But they are by no means the same thing. I hope that this casted any clarity at all at the term.
No, it did. And I also think when we think of Marxism in a historic sense, what that model looked like in Russia and Europe would not necessarily work in its purest form in the United States. Is that where kind of it started to morph and adopt into different kind of strains and ideologies?
Part of it is that this has to do with a lot of the history of Marxism, which I think is becoming increasingly important, and I think it's very important to have more people who are actually looking at that again. So basically, as I said, the process of this decomposition of Marxism actually started early on, started around World War II. So the Russian Revolution itself, in a sense, was the end of one major stage of the history of Marxism, in which Marxism existed as this unified and cohesive theory. It still had a disagreements, especially with the issue of revisionism and the rise of social democracy. So basically, you had Marxists who left the Marxist consensus, abandoned revolutionary politics, and opted to party parliamentary politics in Europe as a way for achieve a lot of the goals of the labor movement. They became known in Europe as social democracy. That's kind of the main split in Marxism before the Russian Revolution, before the Soviet Union. With the rise of Soviet Union, you have bigger splits. Basically, Marxism split into two: Eastern Marxism, and that was basically defined. So you had geographical terms. So that's the Soviet Union, Russia. I think a lot of the national liberation movements went into that category. For example, the regime of Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. And then you had something called Western Marxism that started to form. And that was Western Marxism, unlike this Eastern form, which was, we're talking about political parties, we're talking about revolutionary movements, we're actually talking about power. Western Marxists had no power. And they retreated into the universities to some of the most actually elite intellectual endeavors, epistemology and philosophy, and so on. And they abandoned class politics whatsoever. And in these movements, there are major alteration happened to the way that they think about Marxism. That is, Marxism was no longer about class struggle, which is one of the definitive features of Orthodox Marxism. The Western Marxists abandoned class struggle, any notion of class struggle at all. Kind of almost they said a farewell to the working class, and then they started adopting new emancipatory ideas that focused many times around the idea of eros, or the liberation of the eros of man, or sex, and that's why Freudianism then actually kind of merged in this endeavor. So basically, it took a very different route. It's not that the Soviet model, all of a sudden, that was part of the development, basically, especially in the 1950s, when the true nature of Stalinism started to become apparent. So that it's a criminal regime, it's a totalitarian regime. There was the famous speech denouncing Stalin by the leader of the Soviet Union. I think it was 1956, Khrushchev. So these things definitely helped in basically disassociating Western Marxists from that, what they call that Eastern Marxism of that's really Asian despotism and Slavic tyranny, and they creating this new form of Marxism. That was part of it, but it wasn't the only thing. We have also movements from politics to culture, movements from the concept of labor to the concept of sex or eros primarily, and a larger adoption or a more embracing attitude towards a lot of the foundational liberal ideas. And that's kind of when you get this rapprochement between a lot of liberal thinkers, a lot of Marxist thinkers. So basically, these new Western Marxists accepted by virtue of condemning the Soviet Union as tyrannical and Russia as tyrannical. This is really what existing communism is. So basically, obviously, our Western liberalism, exploitative as it may be, unjust as it may be, is superior to these Asiatic communist models. You had that with critical theorists who started praising even liberalism for its liberating the individual. And then basically the idea was to take that base of liberty and radicalize it even further. I hope that didn't confuse people more, but the goal of my explanation of this is to basically say it's much more complex, that the historical development of these tendencies cannot really be described very easily in one movement or in one motif. We can say, that this came out of this or this was not applicable. No, it was actually a lot of things happening at the same time.
Mm. No, that's actually really helpful. So when we can just trace kind of through the breakdown of Marxism in Russia, so Western Marxism kind of then retreated to academic institutions, and it's there that they met with maybe American liberals and they share some ideas. So what are those kind of shared ideas, and then where would maybe traditional Marxism diverge from American liberalism?
So there are tendencies in liberalism in general that were always similar, because by the end of the day, both of them are ideologies of the Enlightenment. So both of them, they share some fundamental Enlightenment presupposition on the supremacy of reason, the ability of human rationality to completely subordinate reality, the supremacy of the economy. I mean, I would say even Marxists abandoned that at one point. Western Marxists, when they directed themselves to the issues of culture, but liberals didn't abandon that. The supremacy of economic relations have always been central to a lot of liberal thought, and there is a general a belief in the myth of the philosophy of history. Now, there are big variations between the philosophy of history seen by Marxists and seen by liberals. But basically, that history has this teleological structure that ultimately reveals itself at the moment of the Enlightenment. So the moment of European Enlightenment, this is kind of an apocalyptic moment, apocalyptic in the sense of the Christian sense of revelation. So the Enlightenment was this apocalyptic movement that revealed to us the truth of reality, the truth of ourselves, the truth of our history, that leads us then to fulfill the end of history, which for Marxists was communism. For liberals, as Fukuyama would talk about later in his famous 90s book, The End of History, basically the universalization of the liberal democratic state, that we all going to become, Pride Month is going to be a universal, it's not just an American thing. Everybody in Mecca, they will celebrate Pride Month one day. And that this structure is inevitable, that this is not a myth, this is not a superstition, this is a scientific understanding of reality. So obviously they share together a lot of these assumptions and suppositions. Commitment to egalitarian politics, I think, is very important, and distribution in general. also means very different things. Marxists always had problems with a lot of their theories. For example, they always had a problem and a lot of doubt, secret doubt, with the idea of the labor theory of value, which is basically labor's determined value. And that was always a problem, big problem of Marxism. And then yet, for example, liberals didn't deal with that problem. John Rawls famously, in his 1971 book, I think Justice is Fairness, he defined value and defined fairness in different ways that a lot of Marxists, actually Western Marxists, later accepted. So the point is, there are tendencies in liberalism that have always shared a lot of assumptions. Not everything. They didn't share, of course, historical materialism. They didn't, but they shared some of the primary or the foundational philosophical assumptions of Marxism.
So when I think of what's being taught in college campuses, I would characterize it as critical theory. I mean, I remember being in college like pre 2020 when I think this was taken to the masses with just all the political upheaval following the death of George Floyd, and then BLM, started to adopt for the masses a lot of the language that I would see in my college classroom, such as institutional racism. You have to divest from your whiteness, that idea of white fragility that I had really only heard in a college classroom. And so I mean, I attribute it also just to Instagram, like these infographics and just the popularization of this new vernacular when it comes to the social justice movement. I really saw that in the classroom. So what is the critical theory, I guess, academic movement within American institutions? What's kind of the cornerstone teachings of that, and how does it diverge maybe from other critical theory ideas? Because I know there's different schools of thought.
That's a great question. You're right. The entire vernacular, our entire language, have completely transformed, I think, in the last decade. If we get somebody with a time machine to travel from 30, 40 years ago to come to an American city and hear just an average educated person talking, I don't think they recognize a lot of things that they are saying. And a lot of this, of course, is the work of the modern university, the central institution that's responsible for shaping really the culture of society. Um, so critical theory, just very very quickly, critical theory is a branch of Marxism, or a form of Marxist theory, very specific, that developed by certain German Marxist theoreticians, also collectively known as the Frankfurt School, in the 1920s. And they called it critical theory just so they wouldn't call it Marxism. And this was the first time. Before that, Marxism was really associated with labor politics. So it was politics, agitation for the revolution. Of course, they had intellectuals fulfill itself in Russia. But with the Frankfurt School, for the first time, Marxism was becoming something academic. They are the ones who actually made of Marxism a method of academic investigation. And in that, they were inspired by the seminal writings that founded all of this way of thinking, that is Marxism as method, was the Hungarian communist George Lukács, who's considered to be the founding father of Marxist theory. And basically, in his writings, he basically said that Marxism is not just a political theory. It's not just historical materialism. It's a method of knowing truth. That's a very fun. That's a profoundly religious claim. Think about this. The word orthodoxy means really way or method. So it's a way. Marxism was the way. It's a method of knowing truth. So we're no longer talking about fulfilling communism. We're no longer talking about leading the proletariat in its class struggle against the bourgeois in order for that to establish the socialist state through the revolution. We're no longer talking about that. We're talking about academics who are sitting in a center that was started in the University of Frankfurt, who are treating Marxism as a method of knowledge, primarily, method of social knowledge, knowing society. Some of the most important names were Max Horkheimer, who was I think he was the second director of the Frankfurt School. You had people like Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, Eric Fromm. You have some many people who became the founding figures of critical theory. Now, as they were doing that, they will go through different stages. That is, the very beginning of critical theory, they thought about it very differently, or maybe in a more moderate sense, than they will start thinking about it during World War II. A lot of them were Jewish. World War II, and this sadly, this fact is often used in anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, that basically critical theory is this Jewish endeavor that is made to eviscerate white Christian societies from their essence. This is just pure anti-Semitic gibberish. The fact is, yes, most of those critical theorists were Jewish, but they were not Jewish in any recognizable sense. Other than just lineage. They were just atheist Marxists, kind of the type that the modern university created. They had so during World War II, they will get radicalized because, of course, the terrible experience. A lot of them will be in the United States. They'll spend the wartime in the safety of the United States, and they will write the really most radical form of critical theory. This is the one that will pick up in the United States. Not the earlier form of critical theory, and not the later form, because a lot of them, after they will go back to Germany, almost all of them went back to Germany, with the exception of Marcuse, who stayed at Columbia. They will actually moderate quite a bit. That is, they will become, even the leftists, dislike that phase. They say that they became conservative. I don't think they became conservative. They just moderated their stance. They became pro-American. They were pro-Israel, actually, believe it or not. So Adorno was pro-Israel. Horkheimer was, not that they weren't critical of Zionism, but when it came to the Arab-Israeli conflict at the time, they wholeheartedly, unequivocally supported Israel. Horkheimer, for example, in his writings, describe Nasser, who was the leader of Egypt's wars against Israel at the time, as a new Hitler, and Arab nationalism. He saw it as a variation of fascism. He was wrong with that. But that's not, that later form of critical theory that will develop in the 50s and 60s. That's not really what the American academics are going to develop. The one that will be most influential is really the World War II phase. That was extremely radical. It was, in a way, anti-Marxist in the sense that it completely exploded the structure of historical materialism, and kind of abandoned the belief in progress, considered the Enlightenment to be myth, and considered that the dehumanization that was in the Holocaust to be the true nature of the Enlightenment. Now, that's very different than what classical Marxism thought about the Enlightenment, when the liberals thought about the Enlightenment. It's a complete condemnation of Western thought from its emergence in ancient Greece and Athens until the Enlightenment, that it was this march of instrumental reason, what was a central term that they used, towards this dehumanization or complete instrumentalization of reality, whether nature or social reality itself, that ultimately leads to death and destruction, and so on. It was extremely radical. I mean, if you read their central work at the time, The Dialectic of the Enlightenment, it's very hopeless and very dark. I mean, jazz music is just the kind of the drums of barbarism, of American barbarism. American democracy is just another version of Nazism that's just kind of sweet, sugar-coated, kind of infinitely condemnatory. This work, or this phase of critical theory, will continue in the American universities, primarily Columbia, especially that one of them, Herbert Marcuse, will stay. He's the only one who's not going to go back to Germany. He's going to stay in the United States. And he will offer this anti-technological, anti-American, anti-liberal, anti-democratic, anti-humanist version of critical theory that will become extremely popular. Now, all of these things will later then be developed into, again, they will themselves will decompose. So we have kind of a process of constant evolution that doesn't stop somewhere. And this form of critical, and at every step, it will also get diluted and get simplified into a repertoire of slogans. And that's basically what started happening in the American universities since kind of the cultural revolutions in the late 60s. And then you will have the birth of all of these different critical disciplines. So you have critical legal studies. Then you will have critical race theory. critical gender theory, critical queer theory, so on and so forth. And all of them are adaptations. So think about it as a discipline or localized adaptation of that a very condemnatory, almost nihilistic critical impulse to critique the cultural and social structure of society in order to expose the dehumanization and kind of the fascism that's lingering in its heart, whether in its language, whether in its legal system, whether it's an educational system. And that's how you get your shirts. Fashion is sexist. I don't know if you read these articles. You see them. I see them all the time now in the Atlantic and mainstream publications, right? So basically the way that capitalism designed our shirts, they design it in a sexist way. Math is racist. So that's how you end up. So this is a particularly American version of critical theory. And I hope I made that somewhat clear. So this is an American development and reading of a version of critical theory from European history. In Germany, ironically, as far as I can tell from my engagements with German leftist intellectuals, they have a very different version of critical theory, and they often look with bewilderment at what the Americans are doing and what the Americans are saying. Some of them, especially the Orthodox Marxists, do not consider what's happening in the United States to be related. I'm not saying that I agree with them. I think they were wrong, but I understand why, and I hope my listener will now understand why people who are still loyal to some form of Orthodox Marxism, uh, uh, insofar as they still exist, when they look at what's happening in the American university, they would say this has nothing to do with Marxism. This is just liberal decadence, bourgeois reactionary kids who are playing with Marxist slogans for greater sexual liberation and so on and so forth. But this is not. Now, I don't agree with them, but I understand where their logic is coming from. That is, if you believe that Marxism should be about the working class, labor politics, so on and so forth, class struggle, historical materialism, then yeah, then you look at this and you think that this is a joke.
Would you feel comfortable in sharing why you would maybe disagree with kind of the claim that this has nothing to do with maybe more traditional Marxism?
I agree and disagree. That is the a lot of the impulses are very liberal. That is this um, uh, sexual the cult, the eroticism, right? The cult of eros. That truly is became one of our biggest religions. I mean, I think now when I look at the United States, which is primarily an atheist, officially the state is atheistic, the civilization is atheist. You see kind of various ideologies that are trying to give it content, because atheism is a negation by the end of the day. It has no content. So it needs its own content, kind of a religious content. One of them, one of the biggest, is eroticism. The other being social justice, ecological apocalypticism. That's also one of our biggest religions, and scientism, and it's the weakest one of them. Funny enough. But eroticism. When I look at eroticism, I just can't see. It makes the Soviets look conservative. That is, if you look at that American, particularly American development, I look at it and I don't know what that has to do with traditional communism. Truly, it's very liberal. However, you cannot deny that the theoretical foundation, that the battering rams that were used to destroy the structure of the traditional family, to push for this eroticism were actually Marxist tools crafted specifically against capital society, against Western societies, against the quote unquote bourgeois morality, by which they meant Christianity. They would not have done, that is, those liberal kids since the 1960s till today, they would not have been able to do any of this if it wasn't for the genius of all of these critical tools crafted by some of the most genius Marxists in history. So I agree and disagree at the same time.
Would you be able to kind of walk us through? So, when did And you touched on this a little bit, but when did maybe more traditional forms of critical theory get co-opted in the university system to emphasize kind of the sexual liberation, the eros, as you said? Because when I look at, even to make this applicable to what we see on social justice like movements on campuses, you'll see queers for Palestine, or feminists for Palestine. I've been to protests where people show up wearing like pro-abortion, like sexual liberation t-shirts, might dress half naked to make a point about another social justice movement. This idea that the liberation of the Palestinians as a liberation, and the sexual liberation for all here in the United States on college campuses. Somehow there is this overtly sexual undertone to it, and we see that kind of applied to the different identities, so race, gender. Where did that come in? You mentioned Freud. Was that kind of the academic kind of segue into co-opting other forms of critical theory?
Well, okay, it's I just want to give a disclaimer. The fact that we can have some sort of an idea how these developments happen. I don't think that you will ever have be able to particularly or specifically point out or chart how things happened exactly. It's very hard because society, you will never be able to amass enough information about what happened at any point of time in society. So I can try to give a broad picture. So the obviously, since the beginning of what we call the Enlightenment, sex has been, of course, a central issue, and of course, sex is a central human problem. Let's call it. You cannot deny that sex is fundamental part of human life. It's one of our main concerns. It's a primary way of reproduction. It was a concern of all of the major world religions. I mean, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam have a huge moral code specifically dedicated to the issue of sexuality, which now they are condemned because of that. So sexuality is a major. Even the pagan religions before that were obsessed with sex. Humans are obsessed with sex. That's kind of the and with kind of the Enlightenment, you had a lot of these obsessions getting released anyways. I mean, the most famous of them, of course, is the Marquis de Sade. With almost his invention, the guy single-handedly invented pornography, pretty much. So you already had these tendencies. You always had the concern with sex in the background. This is not unique to anybody. Marxism, in its beginning, didn't really concern itself with that issue. You had references because as I said, it's a total theory. It can explain everything. Sometimes you had things touching it. So Friedrich Engels, who was Marx's associate, did write a book about gender and the structure of the family, in which he basically kind of had a feminist outlook about the capitalist suppression of women. You had, I think, that I know of, the earliest Marxist theorist who talked about eros specifically and erotic oppression as part of capitalism was actually Werner Sombart, who was big Marxist theorist who abandoned Marxism, became kind of a quasi-German fascist later on. But he did write that basically Judaism provided us with our sexual repressive ethos that then helped us develop capitalism. So you had these remarks always. But it wasn't really until the critical theorists, Adorno and Horkheimer talked about this in their big book during World War II, The Dialectic of the Enlightenment, and how basically the authoritarian personality, so the fascist personality that put those Jews in the oven in Auschwitz, and for them it's the same personality in America, right? Because America is just Nazism with a human face, so to speak. So that authoritarian personality is basically the main personality structure of the Western male, and it is acquired through repression. So you have the very first intimation, and repression is a Freudian term. So you already have these very first a kind of cross fertilization between, or the adoption of a lot of Freudian ideas by already had it at a very early stage of critical theory. Just very quickly, for those, Freud was not a revolutionary thinker. That is, Freud was actually a bourgeois thinker. A lot of the Orthodox Marxists used to despise him and despise his ideas because they didn't fit with classical Marxist theory. So it was actually quite a novel development that you'll have Marxists being interested in Freud, starting from the 1920s, 1930s, and after. Freud was already a big deal in liberal societies, for separate from this whole critical theory development. That is because of many aspects of liberal society. First of all, liberal society lacked a theory of alienation, and that was always a problem. What do I mean, a theory of alienation? So, one of the fundamental doctrines of Christianity that really, from which all of Christian anthropology springs, is the idea of the fall, that human nature has this irreversible consequence of the fall that makes us broken and tends towards doing evil. And this is why salvation is necessary for humanity, and humanity cannot basically cannot live without original sin. So the doctrine of original sin. You already had that doctrine becoming very problematic for a lot of philosophers in the Enlightenment for various reasons. And then you had a lot of liberals basically shitting it away completely, and you have this very optimistic view of human nature and humanity that's just perfectible and so on. The Marxists had a theory of alienation. I mean, alienation is a Marxist term, as a matter of fact, that they inherited from Hegel. But basically, yes, you have a fallen nature, but they blamed it on capitalism. So you have really a religious structure of, of course, you're broken and you feel alienated from yourself and from nature and from the world. You do feel that, but it's because of capitalism. And once the revolution happened, you're saved. Liberals never had anything just very optimistic, but that's not how we live. I mean, you can't really pretend that everything is good and everything is all right and you're very happy constantly all the time. It's kind of, I think, the liberal cartoonish, what people see, the caricature that people have of liberal societies. So, for example, in Egypt, I remember, and I'm sure in many other non-Western societies, when they look at liberal Western societies, they say like they are cold people and they have no depth. I think that's what they are identifying. They're identifying a personality, a level of superficiality that you have to live in as a consequence of this flattening of human nature. But again, reality is not like that. Freudianism offered for liberal society a suitable theory of alienation that was not revolutionary. So basically, you're alienated because, you feel alienated because you're sexually repressed, or you have repressed desires, childhood memories, things like that. And then psychoanalysis and psychotherapy then helps you to feel better. So then you had liberal societies developing Freudianism into this huge industry. Not just industry, it became really, I mean, Freud is as influential as Marx on our modern world. People talk in psychobabble all the time. We talk in the language of trauma, therapeutic. Philip Rife has an amazingly insightful book on this called The Triumph of the Therapeutic. It was already written in the 60s about these tendencies. So basically, Freud was a towering figure in the modern age in general. Then you have critical theorists, to go back to what we're talking about, also separately accepting a lot of Freud. And then basically in the 1950s and the 1960s in American universities, you had a lot of those very early critical theorists, primarily Herbert Marcuse, working extensively on making Marxism this theory of erotic liberation. He, of course, had a forerunner, some guy called Wilhelm Reich, who was a student of Freud, a disgraced student of Freud. Freud kicked out of his circle. But basically, he wrote a book, I think, very early on called The Sexual Revolution. He's the one who coined the term. And you see in it the earliest kind of intimation and this idea that basically that Freud or Freudian concepts of repression and release or liberation has revolutionary consequences. That is, if the society is established through the repressing of sexual desires, then the one way to liberate people from this authoritarianism, this uptightness, this just fascist mentality that wants to control everything, is to actually liberate them sexually. So the sexual liberation became a necessary way for the revolution. That's kind of the leftist way of thinking about it. That does not mean, and I have to assert that a lot of the sexual liberation activists agreed or understood any of this. So a lot of them, and you see that in the 1960s in American universities, French universities, German universities, were young people who did not have, who felt sexually repressed by their parents' generation. And basically what a lot of these theorists, Wilhelm Reich and Herbert Marcuse, said, they found as an appropriate tool for the sexual liberty that they desired. So they instrumentalize it in a way. So here you have, this is, I go back to the introduction that I tried to give. You have really multiple things happening at the same time. You can't say that it was one thing. No, you had these kids who were growing up in a post-materialistic, post-Christian society who the sexual morality of their parents made no sense to them anymore. I mean, if you're really not Christian anymore, if you live in a very affluent society, it doesn't make sense why you have to abide by traditional morality. So they needed a way to for them to be free. And then you have these critical theorists who provided them with immoral discourse. And that's basically what critical theory became, with this moralistic discourse through which they can win that sexual freedom that they wanted from the institutions of their parents.
I want to show for the audience too, who might not maybe be in academia, this is kind of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about kind of sexuality being this lens in the university systems for analyzing, social constructs, governance, politics, the female's role in society. This is Cornell's course list for this upcoming semester, but you have feminism and Islam in North Africa. You have women and gender in the Bible. These are kind of courses that I took throughout my time in the university system. Yeah, queer classics. This is very common, especially in, maybe if you were in the hard sciences, STEMs, you wouldn't encounter this in your time on a university campus. But for someone like me who is in political science classes, international affairs courses, religion courses, this was kind of the default lens through which to view all religion. I remember learning about Christianity through the lens of like feminism, and I was like, this is not even representative of what Christianity is. But it's this all-encompassing worldview, and I think it's also linked to postmodernism, which you touched on. Where do postmodernism and maybe neo-Marxism, if we're going to use like a really broad term, where do they agree on some ideas, and where do they disagree? Because I think postmodernism is also a really big kind of ideological worldview in which we can look to what's happening just in our larger culture and society beyond college campuses, and point to some of the chaos that we are now living in.
It is chaos. It's like we're living after the Tower of Babel. The tower has already collapsed, and we're all now living in great confusion. So postmodernism, that's a particularly French development. It started as a particularly French development. Is a French reading of German philosophy, specifically of Nietzsche, Heidegger, and started developing in the 1960s, and really came to dominance, I think, after the Cultural Revolution started. When the Cultural Revolution was a global event, really happened everywhere. And the most famous people are Jacques Derrida, the master of deconstruction, and Michel Foucault. And Michel Foucault, I think, is extremely popular on American universities. Now they differ significantly. So postmodernism is a critique of the Enlightenment and all of its products, including Marxism. That is, it's a revolt on meta-narratives, including that of Marxism and liberalism, both of them, right? So the idea that there's a history and history has meaning, and it's teleologically marching towards a certain. That's a story, right? It's a story. It's fiction. Somebody came up that, according to postmodernists, that's just a story fiction that just was meant to obtain power or resist power. So everything really is about power. But basically, uh, the dissolution of all concepts of knowledge and truth into basically discursive and linguistic mechanisms. Uh, so Marxism, including critical theory, still maintains a commitment to objective truth, even if it's hard for it to define that, even if the definition slips from period to period. They do believe in a revolutionary truth. They do believe in a truth of a certain image of mankind that Marxism needs to achieve. There is a concept of objectivity, of truth. Marxism considers itself a scientific endeavor, and scientific in the modern sense means objective. It's truthful. Now, postmodernism does not consider the science, the very concept of science, to be fiction. That is, postmodernism is a discursive analysis of all of the human products of intellect, to show them as nothing but mechanisms for power. And that's basically what you get with Michel Foucault's theory. And everything becomes then domination and counter domination. That's really what we do. All our institutions are just prisons. The classroom is a prison. The clinic is a prison. The doctor, who's really an oppressor, who's wearing a coat. That coat is just a discursive signal to give him power over you. That's kind of the analysis, very simplistically, the way that you get to the denial of all objective reality and truth, and everything comes down to power. So obviously there is major tension between Marxism and critical theory and postmodernism itself. Where do they agree? As I said, is the commitment. They have the same commitment of anti-capitalist emancipatory politics, anti-Western, anti-Christian ideas of emancipation of the individual from the shackles of society. So that's why I think a lot of people think of them as this one big thing, kind of this almost one big movement. That, as a matter of fact, they have heavy tension between them. That doesn't mean that I agree necessarily with any of them or with either sides, but that's basically what they are together. And the fact that they have tension doesn't also mean that there are cross pollinations all the time. Again, they have hybridities. This is why it's very complex to talk about social developments in that way. For instance, identity politics primarily, as it was developed by Edward Said, and that's very relevant to what's been going on to campuses, especially it has to do with Israel and Palestine. You'll find that Edward Said actually used a lot of different theoretical structures and tools that were developed by classical Marxist theorists, critical theorists, and postmodernist intellectuals, Foucault. So, for example, the main work of Edward Said, Orientalism, it rests upon Lenin's definition of imperialism. So, imperialism is the last stage of capitalism, and that defines basically the relationship of capitalist society to the rest of the world. And on the Gramscian notion of the intellectual, so the intellectual as primarily an agent of class or of power, and then you have the Foucauldian notion of power itself, and basically you mix these things together, and you get the theoretical or the intellectual construct that was Orientalism, that basically American Orientalists or academic specialists in the East and the Orient and Islam and so on, they were not really intellectuals. They were soldiers. They were fighters and warriors at the armies of the Western capitalist empires, and they produced knowledge that did not aim at actually explaining reality or resembling reality, but the very the very aim of these intellectual discourses is actually the domination of the East. That's kind of in a nutshell what Orientalism is about. So that very academic discipline of talking about Islam, talking about Arabs, talking about the Middle East. The academic discipline is not really an academic discipline. Think about it as one of the arms of the Western armies that trying to dominate the East. So that the foundation of all of this intellectual structure is Foucault, Adorno, Gramsci, Lenin, ultimately, of course, Marx himself. And that's basically a very American thing. That is only in America you get this you get this ability to create a new idea made of kind of these different sharpnels of all of these different intellectual ruins, and pass it as a great liberal endeavor for greater equality and justice. Right? That's basically what a lot of people see liberal side. Liberal side. Edward. That's a Freudian slip. Edward Said as like Edward Said is a liberal kind of waspy figure, a universalist, a humanist who fights for universalism and secularism, all of these things that that liberals like the most. And the foundation of his ideas is basically Marx, Lenin, Gramsci, Adorno, Foucault, so on and so forth. That's a very American product. And that's basically what happened in the American university. And the American university became the capital of this globally. That is, in the history of Western radicalism that came out of the Enlightenment, there were phases in which different places took the lead. That is, Germany, of course, was leading for a very long time. A lot of the foundational philosophies came out of Germany. Then the French, especially after World War II and the destruction of Germany, the French and the Italians took over. So French universities and Italian universities were the centers of radical ideologies and philosophies for decades. A lot of the third world got its radicalism, for instance, from Paris. But today, since the 1970s to today, it's actually the Anglophone world. It's the English-speaking world. It's actually even in the UK and American universities, we're the ones who are actually taking the lead in producing much of this radical literature that's now, I think, completely mixed with liberal ideas and liberal prejudices.
You touched on something that I've just observed as making no sense, and you might not have an explanation for it because it might just be the chaos that you described in the ruins of all these different ideologies. But when I think of university campuses and this postmodern kind of view of deconstructing society of traditional values, family values, gender roles, um, I am oftentimes confused at the rejection of Christianity, for example, and then the embrace of Islam, or at least the excusing away of what would be even more radical ideas of women in the home and the family. Why is there this embrace and or just maybe willingness to turn a blind eye to these very radical, or what they would define as oppressive systems within the Islamic world, and then this just pure rejection of Christianity as kind of the evil of society? How how can that happen? How can that like logically exist in this ideology? Or maybe it's illogical and that's the answer.
Well, it's very it's illogical and illogical. So it's not Islam that they are embracing. Just be clear, they are not embracing Islam; they're embracing Muslims. As a matter of fact, for a lot of these, I think professors, Islam is a reactionary force. Muslims are a revolutionary force. So there is a difference here. They see Islam. If they pay lip service to Islam, it's actually, I think, more often than not, is to be nice to their Muslim activist allies. But basically, Islam is a religious reactionary force, like any religion. I think for a lot of people, it's like that. It's what's revolutionary, what's subversive, is Muslims themselves. And this is a very, I think, cynical and almost sinister view of society. I think it causes not just it causes a lot of mayhem and chaos. Also draws a lot of racism from a lot of people on the right who don't understand a lot of these issues, but they can tell that Muslims are being used as a subversive force. How, why, of course, nobody and most people are not patient enough to try to actually see what's going on. So that's kind of and this is, by the way, this is not the first time. This is almost identical to how a lot of these Marxist theorists also and critical theorists throughout the time viewed Jews and Judaism. So at many points, I mean, this is not monolithic. You had varying views. Judaism was seen as reactionary, but Jews as a revolutionary force. So the idea is to break the self-conception of Western society, whether the self-conception that it's Caucasian, white, or Christian, so on and so forth. You see that primarily the main one of the main expressions was a little book called The Non-Jewish Jew by a communist intellectual by the name of Isaac Deutscher, a Trotskyist primarily. But basically in it he says, and you see it from the title, non-Jewish Jew. So for him, he would explain that Judaism is reactionary, so he's not Jewish, but being a Jew is revolutionary, so I'm a Jew. And of course, his conception of a Jew, I don't want to leave it things here, but the way that these people mean being a Jew is, it's not what Orthodox Judaism thinks of a Jew, because that's reactionary. It's not what Christians think of a Jew is. They have a revolutionary atheistic definition of what is a Jew. So they define a Jew as something that's anti-Western primarily. That's how this guy wrote it. I agree, and that's why I honestly came to completely support orthodoxy in actually all religions. I think Orthodox Judaism, Orthodox Islam, Orthodox Christians, or the Orthodox conceptions, I think this is what people need to hold on to. So you have this structure, way of thinking that was already present. And that's basically, Edward Said will have some of that. So the idea is that being Arab, being Palestinian, being Muslim, and that's you get that baked into identity politics, is revolutionary. So because you're subversive, you're a subversive force inside this capitalist society that helps you subverting it. So I don't think a lot of these people see that Islam as this revolutionary subversive force. I think they see that Muslims are, and Islam is a reactionary force. That's one version of it. There's a version of it in which Islam, as it's defined by Islamist movements, is indeed revolutionary. And I think we talked about this before, that basically one of the largest conceptions of Islam in modern times is actually a modern construction of post-Enlightenment revolutionary philosophies. A lot of people hate this because I do think that there are a lot of, whether just people are not informed, there is the prejudice. People would like to believe that Islam is bad, always has been bad and evil and so on. I think a lot of people like to hold on to those ideas for various reasons. I don't think it's true at all. I think there is a new version of Islam that developed in the last 200 years that accepted a lot of the foundational revolutionary and radical narrative that came out of the Enlightenment. That what's generated political Islam, whether the Muslim Brotherhood, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hamas, Iran. And of course, you see it in the rhetoric, you see it in their anti-Americanism, you see it in their anti-Zionism, you see it in all of that. Now, that Islam is also a revolutionary force, obviously, because if your criterion for determining subversive and revolutionary is anti-Western, anti-American, then there is no doubt about it. So you have these, I think, multiple things going on. You have people who not necessarily interested in Islam as a religion. Yeah, it's a religion, it's reactionary, but the very presence of Muslims in society is subversive, and they should be cultivated as activists within these coalitions of activism that we're now seeing, the DEI and intersectionality and so on. So you have that, I think, happening. And also you do have their actual revolutionary interpretations of Islam that people are becoming fond of. And then you have people, I also want to have some good faith or give people some leeway. You do have a lot of, I think, genuinely naive liberals who have very good intentions. Is that they do believe that that Islamophobia exists. There are a lot of people who unfairly hate Muslims, and it's their duty to help Muslims become at home, and that Islam is a good religion, or it's just a normal religion like any other, and people have the right to believe it. Kind of the superficial liberalism that I mentioned earlier, that doesn't really understand any of the issues that we discussed here, doesn't understand the issues of Muslim societies themselves, that there are different interpretations of Islam. There's revolutionary Islam, there's the Islam of normal people. So yeah, so you have a lot of these things going on, but ultimately they culminate in in the United States. You have now a structure of Islamic activism, whether institutionalized of movement in groups and movements like CARE, the Council of American Islamic Relations, which is now part of the coalition of the Democratic Party, and they are tied to the Muslim Brotherhood, MSA, Students for Justice for Palestine, and they are right at the center of the Progressive Coalition and the Democratic Coalition. And then you have the prevailing Muslim sentiment of actual American Muslims themselves, supporting these movements, not necessarily because these people are revolutionary themselves or that they understand a lot of. Remember, Muslims are also people that they necessarily that there's somebody fighting for their name, somebody's fighting against hatred and racism that's against them, somebody who's kind of who loves Islam and so on and so forth. Again, my goal is always to try to paint a too complex of a picture to be reduced to any one slogan or one single idea. And for this, I think a lot of listeners will hate me, but and I apologize, but I can't do otherwise.
No, this is great. And that does make sense in the sense that, the liberal left on university campuses, unfortunately, Christianity is the status quo that needs to be deconstructed, the backbone of our society. And there is this friendship and the revolutionary identity with Islamism, even though there's great contradictions. I was going to ask, so they agree on the revolutionary nature of their activism, but beyond the revolution, they have very different ideas of what American culture and society should look like. And we've talked before that the postmodern, liberal, maybe neo-Marxist left doesn't really have a vision beyond the revolution.
They don't. And by the way, and you know that. I mean, the very think about what we talked about. Think we talked about the main two kind of intellectual tendencies that we associate with the left today. One of them is called critical theory. One of them is called postmodernism. The main activity of critical theory is critique, which is a negationist theory by definition, right? That's really how critical theory sees itself. The main intellectual activity in postmodernism is deconstruction, which is kind of the discursive activity that's parallel to critiquing, right? You deconstruct, Marxist critique, critical theory, postmodernists deconstruct. Both of these are nihilistic in essence. I mean, you're really just taking things apart. You're not building anything, and they would concede that is they actually have nothing to offer. They have nothing to say. They have nothing meaningful to suggest, and that's why I think also kind of the melange of liberal sentimentality then has to fill that void of now where equality and justice and end of discrimination and everybody feels good and so on, because you really have no vision on this. So Islamism has a vision, terrible vision, but Islamism of course has a vision, and ultimately Islamism will if we pass the phase of deconstruction and critiquing and revolutionary and taking down, and supposedly we're in a phase of building, actually putting something together. Of course, you're going to have the conflict, and this happens in revolutionary movements all the time. I don't think we're so lucky as to see any of this anytime soon. I think kind of the current phase. First of all, the United States remains, despite everything that's going on, it's still a strong society. I mean, now we're facing, I think, very big decisions of either we're going to make it or break it. If we continue on a current path, I think the United States, as is historically known, is not going to exist anymore. There is question even now if it's still salvageable. I mean, if you're really talking about a hopelessly post-Christian society, I really don't know if you can really if we can come back to anything constructive. But that doesn't mean that the end is near. I mean, the end is near is an optimistic. I think this kind of chaos and confusion will only increase, and will continue for a very long time. Is the university changeable? I actually don't think so. I think the university. I don't think that a lot of people actually understand how bad it is in the universities. I don't think a lot of people quite understand the scale of the problem. It's way beyond an administration. It's way beyond donations from Qatar or Saudi Arabia or subversive countries who are trying to control our educational system for their own political agenda. It's way beyond a couple of crazy leftist professors. We're talking about major crises in Western modes of knowledge. Is there even anything to know at this point? Can we know anything? You really, the phase at which our thought, the ways we think today, is at such a dead end that I'm not sure that we can get out of here with what we've been doing so far. I don't want to be too pessimistic. That doesn't mean, by the way, I'm talking about intellectual issues. I don't want people, a lot of these, we're talking about abstractions, we're talking about things in the university. That doesn't mean that you can lead a good life for yourself and your family. I try to do that on my own, despite that all of this is bad. By the end of the day, I try to close the door of my home and try to live my family and raise my child in a good way and just make the best out of the life we have. So I don't want to sound apocalyptic myself in any way, because I'm not.
No, and that's beautiful, and that's what we can do with what we are given. And it is hard not to be pessimistic. And I think too, the dangers of the universities and the decades of this kind of indoctrination or just co-opting the minds of the youth is that we do have an older generation unfortunately dying out and being replaced by a generation that is very post-Christian, postmodern, and those are our future leaders, our future teachers, our future parents, our future political leaders. And so it is kind of a question of where our culture is, and unfortunately maybe kind of sitting at this intersection of the fall of the great America as we know it into something different, something else. Hussein, I want to bring it back to what we were talking about at the top with anticipation that I'm confident we will see more protest on college campuses, especially closer to 10/7. Where does Israel fit into this postmodern critical theory framework? Because I can understand like the revolutionary kind of alliance with Islamism, which obviously the reasons for being anti-Israel are quite clear when it comes to the Palestinian issue. Um, Also, the U.S.-Israel alliance, if you're trying to deconstruct American society, Judeo-Christian values, that also kind of makes sense. But why the issue of Israel? And I think we're also seeing that on the right as well. I don't know if you could also briefly touch on, there's almost like this revolutionary, and this could be a whole other episode that I would love to do, but there's this revolutionary spirit on the right as well, being anti-Israel. And is this a reaction to the revolutionary left? And have we seen something like this in history happen before?
Uh, right and left, to be completely honest, are fiction. The whole spectrum, the whole idea that politics are these objective opinions that exist kind of in the ether on this linear exists in this linear existence from right to left and so on. This just an itself is a superstition, a modern political superstition. And people try to make up for its shortages. I'm sure you've heard this before. People try to make up for the obvious shortages in this way of thinking by talking about a horseshoe. But that's the thing. You're still in the superstition. You're just trying to fix it in order to really correspond more with reality. And people should get credit for that. The whole liberal left thing is part of the super is superstition in a lot of ways, and also the way that Americans understand it is a very American, very recent sense that not necessarily this is how things were in Europe 50 years ago or 100 years ago, or even today. I remember, for example, some I think Jordan Peterson, somebody was discussing, if Nazis were left wing and right wing, which is honestly a meaningless conversation, because you're trying to fit a early 20th century German, intellectual and social political movement into a paradigm of American thinking about politics of 2024. So I encourage people to just be careful around. I still use right and left because that's what most people understand. We don't have alternatives yet. But revolution, there is no right and left. Revolutionary radicalism is one of the main outcomes of, as I said, of the Enlightenment. It exists in various forms. There is nationalist revolutionary radicalism. There is racialist revolutionary radicalism. There is a universalist human rights based revolutionary radicalism. There is a Marxist revolutionary radicalism. There's liberal revolutionary radicalism. So you really are not going to be able to fit a lot on the paradigm of the right and left. And anti-Semitism has always been a core component of this way of thinking or structure of thought in general. Now, to go back to the universities, so the story that I talked about for the last hour, maybe a little bit over an hour, which sounded very much bigger than a lot of people think, much more confused, much more chaotic. Remember that each of those things I talked about, whether critical theory at a certain phase in a certain place, grew to become a whole intellectual institution in its own merit. That's generations of theoreticians, volumes of analysis that's been produced just in every part of corner of that radicalism. But ultimately, the aggregate outcome has been creating this atmosphere of anti-American radicalism on college campuses, right? So you go to the university, you don't believe that you could come out of there if you actually give yourself into what the professors are saying, and you get engaged with some of these activists. You're not necessarily going to come out with any cohesive view of yourself or of the world. And you see it in the confusion and even just physical appearance, right? You see it in the confusion and the way that you think about it. It's just you have nothing. That's it. You're completely deconstructed. You're critiqued, and you're just absolute critique that's just endless of yourself, of reality. Nothing is solid anymore. Nothing to hold to. You're not anchored in anything. You have no a really vision of reality, but you're radical. Not in a very any specific sense. You're just a radical. You take anything very radically. You're anti this, tomorrow you're anti that, and that's why, to go back, I had a conversation with someone who's still in Orthodox Marxist. Orthodox Marxists are rare today. When I meet them, even though that I think Marxism is a terrible way of thinking, it's a fresh of breath air. Like, oh my God, you still exist, Orthodox Marx. At least they had something cohesive that you can argue through. So I met one recently. It's a writer at the Atlantic. There are so many Marxists who write for the Atlantic today. So actually, it's weird. And then I asked them about those people. The identity politics activists, what's going on college campuses, the gender, the whole thing. He said, no. These are not. He was very firm. These are not Marxists. These are liberal identitarian clowns. That's almost word for word by that. And you kind of understand from why his perspective, why he sees them like that. It's exactly this chaos, exactly this. So he created this culture of radicalism that really runs after any cause already. So if you can mobilize them for any revolutionary cause that fits into this paradigm of radicalism, they do. Now, Palestine, or Free Palestine, or the anti-Zionist cause, has always been a revolutionary cause since the 1960s. It was already part of the New Left as it emerged in France, it emerged in the UK and the United States. Marxists before that, by the way, a lot of them were pro-Israel. So if we're talking about the classical left, the French left, for instance, until 1967 was pro-Israel. A lot of the critical theorists themselves, the founder of the theory, were pro-Israel. So that the only Marxists that were anti-Israel, funny enough, were actually the communists. So the ones who actually followed the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was an ally for the Palestinian national movement, for that, and allied for Arab revolutionary republics at large, and anti-Israel, and disseminating too much or a lot of anti-Semitism worldwide. So only Western leftists who still followed classical communism and followed the Soviet Union were actually anti-Israel. The ones who were not, like critical theorists who didn't follow the Soviet Union, they were pro-Israel. With the 1960s, you have the development of the New Left that is not tied, still anti-Soviet, but is also anti-Israel. And the Palestinian national movement was always part of that. So, for example, Edward Said, as I said, kind of the classic face of Palestinian American intellectuals and activists, he was part of the New Left, and then uh, it became the main really or the foreign policy banner cause for that university radicalism, and it's been like that, of course, in the Middle East Studies department. Now the whole Middle East Studies departments in the university is too complex. There is an issue of foreign funding since the 1970s with the oil boom, and you have this hegemony of this anti-Israel and anti-Zionist and anti-American view in there. But of course, that exploded, especially outside of the Middle East department, with the radicalization of the university in general. And then it's very important to remember that this is not just anti-Zionist, or a lot of the people who get there, or a lot of the students and a lot of the professoriate who become part of this radical movement, they are more anti-American. That is, by the end of the day, their revolt and their radicalism is against the United States, is against American foreign policy, in which the support for Zionism and Israel is a central tenet. So naturally, the critique of what they call empire has to take the form of this revolt whenever you have hostilities between the Palestinians and the Israelis, of critiquing Israelis as a form of capitalist, white supremacist oppression of those poor Palestinians that is part of the American empire that is ruling the Middle East and ruling the world. And that's, I think, also is central to this. So this is a lot of this is also anti-Americanism. It's not specifically, of course, they adopt freely anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic rhetoric that they deny that's anti-Semitic, but the primary motive is the anti-Americanism.
Well, thank you so much, Hussein. This was a treasure trove of knowledge. And I encourage the audience to go back and listen to our other few podcast episodes, which I'll also have linked in the description for just even more context on some of the other aspects of Marxism that we've talked about in the past and Islamism. Thank you so much. And I look forward to having you back on.
Thank you. Thank you, Dominique. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of the Philos Project podcast. If you are interested in learning more about the concepts and topics that Hussein addressed in today's podcast episode, I would turn your attention to an earlier episode I did with him entitled The Ideological Roots of Universities' Neo-Marxism and Anti-Semitism. I will link that podcast episode in the description box below. I had also mentioned at the top of the episode that Hussein taught at our recent Pathfinder retreat in Washington, D.C. His lecture on Marxism, fascism, and Islamism will be linked below as well. I also want to point our listeners to Hussein's Substack. I subscribe to a Substack. It is a breadth and a wealth of knowledge on all things Marxism, fascism, Islamism, what's happening in the region. And that is the Abrahamic Critique and Digest. I will link his Substack below and encourage you to go support his work. The Philos Project is a nonprofit, and if you feel so led to contribute to educational offerings such as the Philos Project podcast, we would be so grateful, and I will link that in the description below if you feel led to give. Like always, thank you so much, and I will see you in our next episode.